you all for coming. In fact, before you started to come in, I apologized to Beth for scheduling her so deep into the semester because students and faculty are engaged in finals and long papers and research papers and also people are getting their Christmas and holiday shopping done. So it's not a propitious time for a large audience, but I see that already there are 14 people here. So that's an achievement already. And thank you all for coming. Beth has received her PhD from the history department here at Wayne, and she currently works as a senior lecturer in the Irving D. Reed Honors College. She teaches classes in urban, American, and global studies. Her research interests include popular culture and consumerism, the US civil rights movement, youth culture, urban history, gender and sexuality, the 20th century US and African American history. Right now, she's working on a manuscript which examines how rock and roll music, which is a racially integrated cultural form that achieved popularity in the 50s and 60s, how that reinforced support for desegregation movements among Black and white teenagers, while it also simultaneously crafted contemporary racial liberalism, which obscures the racial structures that reproduces injustice. So while she was doing academic work, she was doing important social work. Um, she's also the co-chair of the Wayne State University Commission on the Status of Women, their PR and marketing committee. She is published. She has a manuscript entitled Integrated Effort, Rock and Roll, Desegregation Movements, and Post-Civil Rights Racial Liberalism, which is currently under contract at Lexington Books. She also has an article which is forthcoming in the July publication of Popular Music and Society, and that is entitled A Teenager in Love, How Black Adolescents Became Teenagers in Rock and Roll Music 1956 through 1960. And that article is available now on the Taylor and Francis website. Her research has been funded with grants from the Humanities Center and Wayne State University's Office of Vice President for Research. And I will have to say that Beth spent a very productive year as a resident scholar in the Humanities Center, resident scholars in the Humanities Center suite, and also has presented papers in our Brownback series before. So she is a friend of the center. So today she'll be talking to us on this topic, Teach Me to Twist, Black Music in White Dominated Spaces, 1960 through 1964. So let's welcome to the virtual podium, Professor Beth Fowler.
Sorry, I'm just trying to set everything up here. Sorry, if you wouldn't mind just giving me a second. There we go. This always takes me a minute in class as well. Okay, cool. Oop, I'm not going to be able to do that, am I? Okay. Can everybody see the slides at least?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
All right, works for me. We'll just go with this, even though it's not a nice slide setup. Okay, so I should preface this by saying that this is a work in progress. This is actually sort of the basis of my second to last chapter in my book draft. So I really just started putting this chapter together about 2 months ago. A lot of it is based on oral histories that I conducted between last summer and this summer. So there's a lot of new information in here. Any feedback that anybody has would be very helpful because my book draft is due quite soon. And I would very much appreciate any ideas or any questions that people have, because especially because this is such a rough version of the basis for this chapter. Okay. All right. So I guess we will begin. Okay. So in April 1962, Chubby Checker, a black pop singer signed to Philadelphia's Cameo Parkway Records, released a duet with white pop star Bobby Rydell entitled Teach Me How to Twist to lukewarm, critical, and popular reviews. And in fact, I had never heard of this record before I started studying this topic, even though I have a pretty extensive knowledge of music from this period. So it was not a hit. However, the cover, featuring Rydell with his hand on Checker's shoulder and both men dressed in similar pastel-colored button-down shirts with V-neck cardigans, instantly relayed a sense of interracial friendship and equality. Even the positioning of both men's names espoused a spirit of integration. Checker's name was spelled out in green letters and Rydell's in blue, but they were positioned to read Chubby Rydell over Bobby Checker, indicating the almost interchangeable nature of their celebrity status. The lyrics to this record also engage the listener in a non-threatening interracial exchange between two friends. Rydell, the supposedly clueless white singer, chants, "Chubby, teach me to twist, for I don't know how, look at all I miss." And then Checker responds, "It's so easy to twist, Bobby. I'll teach you how to twist." Although the song may have reinforced stereotypes about inherent Black dance rhythms and insufficient white physicality, it also presented a friendship between Black and white pop stars as natural and normal. Since Rydell was able to pick up the steps to this easy dance by the end of the tune, the rhythm that is supposedly essential to Black culture is also presented as easily accessible to anyone open enough to engage with it. By the end of the song, the whole world is twisting, and now everybody is doing the twist. So Checker was one of the biggest pop stars of the early 1960s. He first gained popularity with a cover of Hank Ballard and the Midnighters' The Twist, which hit the top spot on the Billboard Hot 100 and R&B charts. Despite his racial background, Steve Chappell and Ruby Garofalo dubbed Checker a member of the second generation of schlock, who was created by a corporate decision and, like his white counterparts, became famous by covering a raucous R&B tune by a Black group. The authors admit that the twist itself is ambiguous socially, since it was first successful at a time when the Black liberation movement in the United States was surfacing, but they ultimately determined that its leading exponent was a harmless, corporate-controlled Black man. It was essentially a frivolous fad welcomed by white audiences as a retreat from the worries of bomb shelters and missile gaps and an ever-imminent imagined war with Russia, but it released white bodies from their petrified stiffness and anticipated more openly sexual dances. As the twist became omnipresent in dance clubs and at sock hops across the country, Black Power activist Eldridge Cleaver agreed that white listeners embraced the more dynamic dance patterns emblematic of working class Black communities, but he posited that this was a political shift rather than just a frivolous fad. The twist was a guided missile launched from the ghetto into the very heart of suburbia, he famously argued in his 1965 memoir, Soul on Ice. The twist succeeded as politics, religion, and law could never do in the heart and soul what the Supreme Court could only write in books. All right, that's basically what we're going to consider that's basically what my entire book tries to consider, but definitely what we'll be considering today. All right, so popular music had effectively desegregated between the late 1950s and early 1960s. By the summer of 1958, so many records had crossed over between the pop and the R&B charts on Billboard that the publication debuted the Hot 100 chart, which consolidated sales data from all genres, thereby integrating the buying habits of different demographic groups. And this is a chart that still exists today. The magazine continued to print separate charts for hot R&B and country and western listings, but the Hot 100 became the publication's predominant chart to guide radio station and distributor purchases. This new list was at first comprised of a solid mixture of white and Black musicians, most of whom defied separate categories and were instead referred to as rock and roll artists. This led Billboard editor Paul Ackerman to claim that popular music was one aspect of America's cultural life where integration has already taken place. By November 1963, which is the chart on the right, actually, both of those charts are from November 1963, Billboard actually stopped publishing a separate R&B chart for a while, and they did not begin doing so again until December 1965. And this was because consumer preferences once again began dividing along racial lines. So by the end of 1963, and I mean, we see this as early as 1958, the charts begin to look so similar that they're not really helping radio stations and record store owners make sales decisions based on the neighborhoods that they're located in. So they basically just stopped printing the separate chart. December 1965, the people's tastes are diverging again, so they start publishing separate charts again. Throughout the early 1960s, hit records from corporatized pop artists like Checker and Rydell, as well as the enormously popular Motown and British Invasion groups, appealed to young audiences regardless of race. And as David Brackett argues, revealed how racial distinctions were weakening, even if white artists consistently maintained higher degrees of popularity on the Hot 100 chart. This so-called integration of popular music meant that public spaces devoted to musical performances and dancing would also be shaped by degrees of interracial mixing. Black musicians alike played to increasingly mixed-race crowds, even if they were strictly segregated in certain areas. In dances in majority white areas that featured music from Black performers, and sometimes even drew Black students from nearby schools and neighborhoods. At the same time, civil rights organizations began staging direct action campaigns, which I'm going to get to here, where predominantly younger Black activists forcibly integrated public spaces in Southern cities by sitting in and refusing to move until served or otherwise acknowledged as full and equal citizens. These campaigns, which were organized to gain as much media exposure as possible, were seen on TV news programs and in magazine photos across the country. Even if teenage fans usually did not enter concert or dance spaces with any political agenda in mind, these shifts in civil rights strategies contextualized how Black and white teenagers listened to music in public, interacted with people from other racial backgrounds, and viewed the potential of desegregation to combat racial injustice. If direct action campaigns provided templates for what an integrated society might look like, musical venues allowed kids who were not involved in activism the chance to share spaces with people or sounds from other races, which potentially reinforced support for desegregation overall. White kids were often eager to see Black performers or dances in traditionally white spaces, and many recall feeling like it was no big deal to enter mixed race areas, even if they rarely encountered people of color in majority white neighborhoods and schools. These responses often reflected positive feelings for desegregation in public spaces as a moral good that could somewhat easily be achieved. Entering predominantly white spaces was, however, more complex for Black teens and musicians who could face threats of violence, exploitation, and exoticization. Even though many also believed that this music could lead to support for desegregation in other public spaces, they realized that this goal would not be quite so easy to achieve. And instead, most Black respondents who I talked to prioritized representation and being treated with dignity over the ability to interact with white kids in the same venues. Oops. Most direct action campaigns in the early 1960s were organized by students and other young people and held at restaurants, department stores, and dime stores. These locations were chosen because they were public spaces that were easy to access, but also because they symbolized the twisted compromise that upwardly mobile African Americans were expected to make in a society that remained fundamentally segregated. They were almost always welcome to spend their money at these establishments, especially in the major chains that were rapidly cropping up in downtown areas across the country. But Jim Crow laws in the South and bylaws in many cities across the North prevented these consumers from being treated with the respect that was granted to their white contemporaries. In Southern states, Black shoppers often had to enter through a separate entrance, generally a back or side door, and were prevented from dining among white patrons, both of which are reminiscent of how domestic servants were expected to behave in white homes. Ed B., I should say, whenever I'm talking about a person whom I actually interviewed, I don't use their full name. I just use the initial. So as to preserve a degree of anonymity. So Ed B remembers going to the back of the stores because the front was reserved for whites, when he was shopping with his mother in downtown Memphis. The backside entrance was there for they called us colored at the time. Further south in New Orleans, Joseph J. remembers lunch counters that had a very long section for white people and a short section for black people. What would happen is that you would have all of these black people standing behind one another trying to get food, purchasing food, because you go hungry and it was a whole thing to go down and shop and eat, and it was a whole day. And what happened was there was a number of situations when you couldn't get your food. These divisions were not usually enforced quite so strictly outside of the South, but consumer spaces often remained segregated nevertheless. Ellis B. recalls how growing up in a largely white neighborhood in New York in the 60s, if you went into a shop or a restaurant in a largely white community and you saw an African American family shopping there, you would do a double take. I think it was unusual to see that. Although David S. recalls riding the bus alongside Black patrons going downtown in Detroit, he also asserts that it wasn't segregated to that point. If you went downtown to the dime store and sat at the lunch counter, everybody sat there and you dealt with it. And Carol B., who also grew up in Detroit, provides a different perspective on these uneasy instances where integration was necessary. As a child with my mother, she would shop in Inkster, which is was a predominantly Black neighborhood at the time. She says, I can tell you that my mother was afraid to be there, but she went there anyway because there was a really nice dress shop. The ability to consume was closely aligned with citizenship rights, and yet African American shoppers were persuaded to spend their hard-earned dollars in spaces where they received second-class or even hostile treatment, and where white customers consistently viewed them with suspicion. These consumption-based spaces were therefore chosen as sites for direct protest, partly to encourage companies to change their policies to oppose Jim Crow laws if they did not want to lose Black customers, but partly because they invoked mass media coverage and degrees of white support. Housing, school, and economic desegregation might prove difficult within capitalist democratic structures, but expecting to be treated with respect as a consumer was supposed to be a pillar of this sort of society. Furthermore, the students and young people who would fuel these campaigns captured the aspirational nature of many Black families who had managed to send their children to university and were on professional tracks, yet still unable to enjoy all of the benefits of consumerism. Finally, Black kids who had already been tacitly accepted into popular consumer culture by advertisers who were eager to sell music, fashion, and other teenage fad items to anyone with disposable income could therefore relate to using consumption as a means of fashioning identities for themselves that were separate from their parents. To be denied the ability to move freely and be treated with dignity in consumer spaces meant that these identities were not deemed valid like their white counterparts, and incited many young people to fight for this particular type of access. So Black activists have utilized direct action in urban public spaces since the early 1800s, but the first student-focused sit-ins at consumer sites occurred during World War II. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see students from Howard University who were the first ones to stage sit-ins in Washington, D.C. area restaurants, and in Chicago by members of CORE, the Committee on Racial Equality, who similarly would stage sit-ins at restaurants where they would be allowed to purchase food, but they were not allowed to actually sit in the restaurant to eat that food. Between 1953 and 1955, students at Morgan State University in Baltimore staged a similar sit-down strike at lunch counters in Reed's drugstore, which forced the company to desegregate all of their city branches. A handful of Black teenagers and their minister, Douglas Moore, were arrested after sitting in booths reserved for white patrons at the Royal Ice Cream Parlor in Durham, North Carolina in 1957. And you can see that's the picture on the left. It was designated as a historical site as an early sit-in. Other sit-ins were organized in Wichita, Kansas in 1958 and in Oklahoma City in 1960. These campaigns, however, were largely ignored by media outlets and were often met with derision from both Black and white community members. Mary Claiborne, who was one of the teenagers who took part in the ice cream parlor sit-in, recalled that many Blacks were madder than the white folks. In her book, Our Separate Ways, Christina Green says that most civil rights and Black organizations, including the local NAACP branch, refused to support this method of protest or the people involved because they feared white backlash and the chaos that might occur if campaigns were not soundly organized from the top down by established leaders. By February 1960, however, Four members of the local NAACP Youth Council, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, Isiel Blair Jr., and David Richmond, gathered in a dorm room in Greensboro, North Carolina to complain that they could shop at their local Woolworth store, but they were unable to eat at the lunch counter reserved for whites. So if they purchased food from the lunch counter, they had to eat on like rickety picnic tables outside the back door. Because of their experience in the NAACP, they were aware of many of the forms of protest used by civil rights activists and were inspired by the concept of nonviolent direct action. They decided the next day to sit at that counter and refuse to leave unless they were served. Their decision to use nonviolence as a tactic, directly confronting the system of segregation and refusing to acquiesce to it, resounded locally and nationally in a way that prior sit-ins did not, revealing both young people's power to provoke change and the frustrations people had with the inability of established organizations to further the movement. Media coverage quickly spread beyond local and even state boundaries, inspiring 150 Black and white students to join the original protesters over the course of a week. Sit-in strikes in restaurants and shops would quickly spread to other college towns, first within North Carolina, and then ultimately to Virginia, Atlanta, Nashville, New Orleans, among several others. This is the best map that I could get from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was a study done on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It's actually not accurate. There were far more sit-ins that were staged between 1960 and 1961 than we see here. But these are the ones that are popping up on the map. And I think that that's pretty impressive as it is, even though we see a lot more sit-ins actually staged in the aftermath of this original one in Greensboro that received so much media attention. The success of student-driven direct protest even led to the creation of an integral civil rights organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, as a means of institutionalizing this drive and encouraging further actions across the country. Activists' enthusiasm was fueled by the fact that this protest method was fairly easy to organize, especially if church or youth groups already existed in the area. Protests could be quickly implemented, did not usually lead to high incidences of violence, and they often were successful, especially after Woolworths announced the desegregation of lunch counters in most Southern stores about 4 months after the original sit-in. The movement's shift to direct action tactics showed how segregation could be challenged with youthful moral righteousness. Perceptions of civil rights activism and who could participate began to change. And yet many Black kids who grew up during this period recall feeling somewhat distant from these struggles. Sometimes this was due to growing up outside of the South, where even when they were faced with persistent racial discrimination and injustice, younger people did not always see evidence of such blatant segregation firsthand. Cheryl J., who grew up in an integrated middle-class neighborhood in Detroit, explains that coming from the environment I came from, there were a lot of things I just didn't think about. I didn't know Black people were being mistreated in the South or wherever they were being mistreated. I just didn't understand any of that. Similarly, Misha B., who also hails from Detroit, yet she says she grew up in an affluent Black neighborhood, says she mostly only heard about these campaigns in church. I thought it just looked bad, she recalled. They kept doing like hoses on people that were just trying to get equal rights and everything, and it would be very sad. But even in a southern city like Memphis, Ed B. explains that he wasn't that involved during the civil rights movement. I wasn't fully aware of the content of it and what the sole purpose of it was, I guess. This was partly because, as he recalled, I grew up thinking that segregation was the norm and I never looked at it as racism that much. But even if he never became explicitly involved in movement activities himself, Ed does remember what he describes as a traumatizing incident that occurred soon after the student sit-ins began in Memphis's downtown business area in March 1960. While working in a restaurant as a teenager one night, he noticed a group of mostly Black young people headed towards the front doors. Even though the closing time was still an hour away, his white manager ordered him to lock the doors. When he asked why, his manager proclaimed, "Damn N-word, I told you to lock the door." I looked at him, Ed recalls, and I looked at the door and I saw these people approaching. It was during the sit-ins. And I told him I wasn't going to lock the door, that if he wanted to lock the door, he had to lock it. I was so pissed off. I said, well, I'm finished. I threw my apron to the floor, went through the kitchen, out the back door, walked around and caught the bus and went home. I never went back. Even if Black kids were aware of these campaigns, many did not think that integration of public consumer areas would do much to affect or improve their daily lives. Others, however, were inspired by these actions, particularly since many of the activists were not much older than they were themselves, which could lead to successful changes. Larry Hunter, who grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan, remembered participating in a high school walkout where students who were guided by their local NAACP branch demanded that teachers acknowledge Black contributions to American history and that the school board hire more Black teachers. We completely shut the place down, forcing a head-on confrontation with the Board of Education, he says. We felt that not only should the textbooks be screened, but there should be a Black history course that would give Blacks as well as whites the opportunity to learn about Black history. More broadly, Joseph J., who grew up in New Orleans, recalls learning about the sit-ins with his mother, who told him, I may not live to see the end of it, but things are going to be different. And that was the paradigm shift. You begin to say, no, I'm not going to settle for this. The potential for change seemed closer than ever, even if many kids remained uncertain of how integration in public spaces would affect their own lives in productive ways. White kids who lived in northern cities often used some of the same language as their Black counterparts when describing how little they thought about racial discrimination during this period, or how they failed to understand the violence meted out against activists. Their recollections, however, are shaped by an inability to identify with these issues based on their geographical and racial distance from Jim Crow segregation. David S., who notes that he rarely paid attention to civil rights struggles growing up in Detroit until he learned about the Greensboro sit-ins, says, it was strange. You'd hear about civil rights on the radio, on television, and in the news. And as a child, you didn't have this frame of reference. You'd heard about it, but you didn't know what it was about. You didn't know what the context of it was or just why this was happening. Ron R. notes how, even though it was not in our territory, which is suburban Ohio, we didn't have a problem with lunch counter segregation or stuff like that. You know, who gets to sit at the back of the bus? That sort of stuff was not an obvious presence for us. Bruce C., who's from suburban New Jersey, also highlights this sense of confusion, stating, I saw, all of the news reports, and it was always like, why are these people, what is happening to these people? Why are the white people doing this? What's going on here? Victor F., who grew up on Long Island, New York, recalls how he saw Black people down south getting the crap kicked out of them by cops and everything else. And I couldn't understand it. You live in your own safe little world, and then you see this stuff on television. It made no sense to me, says Marcia P., who grew up in Detroit. I couldn't identify with them very well. It seemed like they were just happening in other places. And John H., who's from Tucson, Arizona, echoed this feeling of watching events unfold from a safe distance, noting that he remembers thinking, I'm sure glad I don't live back in Knoxville, Nashville, Birmingham, places where they were burning everything down. And I could not understand why a policeman would have a fire hose squirting down a bunch of Black people who were just holding signs. That never made sense to me at all. Bruce S., who watched the protests unfold on television from his home in Queens, says he thought it was unfortunate that discrimination occurred, but we couldn't do anything about it. We could just observe it. This sense of confusion and distance was bolstered by a seeming disbelief that young people in their age cohort could be arrested or subject to brutal violence just for demanding that they be treated as equal citizens. More than their Black contemporaries, white kids who grew up during this period were likely to either express shock over what they saw as an inherent mismatch between the country's democratic standards and treatment of African American activists, or to assert that they had no issues with demands for desegregation, since all citizens were supposed to be treated as equals in the first place. Seeing kids have dogs sicked on them and hoses sprayed, that kind of thing, was absolutely horrifying, says Bill W., who grew up in Washington, D.C. Seeing people beaten because they were marching for free rights and whatever was absolutely horrifying. Larry R. explains that he was less surprised by this treatment because he grew up in a family of communist sympathizers in Philadelphia, where his parents often talked about how activism, civil rights activism, and unfair treatment by the authorities. But he does remember friends who would say something like, oh, you know, at school we were brought up to believe that everybody in America is equal and this is the land of the free. And then I watched on television Bull Connor in Birmingham turning fire hoses on people just trying to register to vote. And I was shocked. Indeed, many white respondents use the language of capitalist democratic frameworks or moral righteousness to explain how they were, of course, sympathetic to Black Southerners who were denied basic rights of assembly. Pat Kay says there were just a lot of things that I knew in my mind weren't right when recalling her growing support for direct action campaigns. I just thought voter registration was the right thing to do. Sometimes you just get a feeling that they are the right things to do. Mary R. points out that in her liberal Seattle home, racial discrimination was always presented as if it was this fundamentally un-American thing, and you would never have any part of it. All of these responses betray a fundamental belief in the inevitability of course correction, that the United States would surely live up to its stated ideals once the evils of Southern segregation were made plain to the rest of the nation. Even if their wording about how the sit-ins did not really affect their daily lives parallels how many Black respondents recall this era, white respondents do not display the same ambivalence about how or whether desegregation in public spaces would affect the trajectory of racial citizenship in the country. Instead, they recall feeling hopeful that these protests would usher in a new era of peaceful interactions among individuals of different races. Although Patricia J. admits that she didn't have time for sit-ins to go to class, she stresses that my heart was with them. And Bruce C. recalls feeling this great sense of the possibility that something was going to change. That here we have all these people and it's Black and white together. That's something. Something's going on here. I had this sense of the moment that this was an important thing that we were taking part in. All right, so these distinctions in how Black and white kids viewed the effectiveness of direct action campaigns were also present in spaces where people gathered to hear music in groups. These segregated or tacitly integrated areas could potentially encourage young listeners to reevaluate the ways that racial discrimination affected their own lives and to react against many of these divisions. Since popular music was one area that was already considered to be integrated, spaces devoted to this music, like school dances, record hops, club performances, and major concerts, drew audiences from all racial backgrounds and provided opportunities for young people to think more critically about the divisions that exist in their own communities. In many cases, Black and white respondents alike claim that they were aware that participating in these events constituted a shift from their normal lives in more segregated spaces. White respondents, however, are more likely to describe these experiences as both exciting and somewhat mundane, while Black respondents are more circumspect about their expectations for any changes to extend beyond the confines of these spaces. Black musicians performing at white high school dances or in white dance clubs did not necessarily challenge local racial norms, though. We can see this with this picture of Little Richard performing for an all-white audience. Um, Even in certain areas of Jim Crow states, white audiences had long enjoyed these types of performances as a form of exoticized entertainment. Ed B. Was a member of a singing group at his school in Memphis, and he does not recall any type of treatment that challenged racial norms when he performed in Memphis, Arkansas, and Mississippi. I don't remember too much discrimination, he says. The only difference that I noted was that the white venues were better clubs. Most of the time we was treated nice, he continues. Basically, we was treated nice and basically we was kids. Our ages were like 15 through 17, something like that. So they didn't treat us that bad. They didn't feed us, didn't drink us, but they enjoyed our meeting. And that's what we was there for anyways. Even though he stresses that they would come up, pat us on the back, say, y'all come back, man, we had a ball, he also says that when it came to white venues, it didn't matter. They just loved the music. In these cases, his experiences differed little from those of Black minstrel or jazz performers who had provided exoticized entertainment to white audiences throughout the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. White audience members may have treated him and his bandmates with politeness, but part of this treatment was contingent on their youth. And they were in no way invited to feel like they were on an equal footing with the people who had come to watch their show. In this case, music and dance were separated from the people who created and performed in these traditions. However, oop, okay. Venues that actually drew integrated audiences could provide potential challenges to these racial restrictions. Ron R. remembers attending record hops in his Ohio hometown where local DJs often played a mixture of records by black and white artists, which he says brought people of different races together and different dance skills. Because DJ collections were often limited to what they were able to play at their home stations, he began volunteering his own records, which he special ordered from Randy Woods' storied music shop in Gallatin, Tennessee. The kids were impressed because they got music that they liked and they could dance to, and they had a chance to hear it, he says, unlike the more conventional pop music playing on most local stations. Even though he lived in a largely white area, Ron explains that Black kids from a neighboring community began attending these record hops. We were intermixed all the time, he says. That's where a lot of white people became aware of the merit of music as a way of bringing people together who might otherwise not be together. And yet, the way he describes some of these interactions is reminiscent of how white respondents try to minimize their own acknowledgments of racial distinctions as they simultaneously voice support for desegregation in public places. He describes some Black acquaintances as the guys who would later get into trouble with drugs and drinking, burglary, and stuff like that. Frankly, not the best citizens of the world. But they would go over to those dances because they appreciated and respected the music and the dancing. So they would go for the music. Even though they weren't actively participants, so to speak, they were at least respectful of it. They respected the people who could do it. He similarly explains how his white friends who were less than physically gifted were able to admit, well, I can't do that, but I can recognize talent when I see it. Even as Ron notes the social possibilities of an integrated dance playlist drawing attendees from different racial backgrounds to the same venue, he tries to minimize the very real racial distinctions in his story by focusing on how dance ability could garner respect among these teenagers regardless of race. He even stresses that it wasn't a racial thing. For those who made it a race thing, that's another matter, I guess. I just didn't really care about that aspect of it. I was already past that or never had it in the first place. Attending integrated dances in these venues did not challenge established perspectives so much as it could reinforce white kids' belief that integration in certain areas did not bother them, and that race should be ignored in favor of individual ability. These perspectives may have been in line with the missions of direct action campaigns, but they would also obscure the need for deeper structural changes and prevent many white people from acknowledging the racism that persisted after segregation in public spaces was made illegal. Black and white music fans also differed in their responses to interracial mixing at larger concert venues. In the South and in some northern cities, concert venues were segregated. As Edgar S. explains, either whites would be up in the balcony or there would be some type of rope, or they would go at a different time. By the late 1950s, as rock and roll shows proved profitable, ah, more and more venue operators revealed that they realized that they were losing money by not allowing patrons of all races to purchase tickets. More and more Black kids had disposable income to spend on tickets to shows featuring white entertainers or integrated acts, and increasing numbers of white kids were trying to see African American acts in Black clubs. In some cases, the same acts were booked for two separate shows, one for Black audiences and another for white audiences, so that racial mixing was prevented from the outset. This way, race mixing could be avoided at all costs, and venue operators did not have to worry about being charged for violating segregation orders. So in my actual book draft, I talk about posters that I was actually able to see at the archives from the Bluefield Auditorium in West Virginia. These are not the posters. I've got them buried, some pictures of them buried somewhere in my archives, but I was able to find some posters online from this venue, and we can see how they very clearly make it clear whether they are catering to a white clientele or a Black clientele. I don't love these posters as much because generally they would be the same poster. They would simply print two versions of it, one that was aimed at a white audience and one that was aimed at a Black audience, but basically it would be the same show. Posters for the two events would look exactly the same. They'd use the same colors, font for the lettering, and even the same pictures of the musical acts performing at both shows. Even though the organizers were careful to plan two shows to keep black and white fans separate, the posters did not need to be altered to appeal to different tastes. They attracted the same kind of teenage music fans regardless of race. By utilizing their power as potential consumers who were not afraid to cross racial boundaries, young music fans were helping to reshape the limits of segregated spaces. Many venue operators realized it would be inefficient to hold completely different shows, though, so they compromised by imposing some form of race based division on the space. Some responded to increasing white interest by allowing white spectators to purchase tickets to all black shows. These tickets cost less than the normal price of admission, but relegated patrons to the backs of theaters, often without chairs, and prevented them from using the dance floor. Again, posters advertising all black rock and roll shows at this auditorium betrayed little racial tension amidst their technicolor designs and the bright, punchy look of their graphics, other than the fact that separate ticket prices were listed for admission and white spectators. There's no difference in how the posters attempted to draw white and black kids to their shows. The assumption was that patrons from both groups would respond positively to the same acts, designs, and slogans. However, as much as this setup allowed concert goers of both races to attend the same shows, it also presented a constant reminder of the indignities of segregation. Gladys Knight and her brother Merrill explained that it hurt to sing for our brothers and sisters in the basement of these auditoriums and to sing for whites with the nice cushioned seats and everything on top. If all else failed, smaller venues divided dance floors with a rope so that kids would be deterred from dancing or even talking to people of different races. Young concertgoers did not necessarily abide by these rules, though. Chuck Berry remembered that at a concert he performed in Mobile, Alabama, over a dozen patrolmen were lined up, forming a path for the show for people to walk through, separating black band members from white fans. The isolation ignited ill feelings in the fans as well as the artists. In some cases, these ill feelings inspired actions that could echo or parallel the methods used by direct action protesters. Ralph Bass, an A&R representative for Chess Records, explained that even when white patrons were forced to sit in roped-off spectator sections, pretty soon they started jumping over the rope to dance among black concertgoers. Venue operators, he said, had to keep enlarging white areas anyway because they just couldn't keep the white kids out, and by the early 50s, they'd have white nights sometimes. That's actually not correct. That didn't really start to happen until the mid to late 50s, but okay. So these areas grew so rapidly that in some cases rules were reversed and dance floors were limited to white patrons with special sections for colored spectators, even at shows with black headliners. In cases where venues were segregated by rope, he says, it was common to see the blacks on one side, whites on the other, digging how the blacks were dancing and copying them. Then hell, the rope would come down and they'd all be dancing together. As early as 1956, rock and roll fans in Houston, Texas, forcefully segregated concert venues on 3 separate occasions in ways that precipitated the use of direct action tactics by civil rights activists. In June, Jet magazine described a concert where the cops got an unscheduled workout trying to stop white girls from dancing with Negro men. They broke up a first floor session only to have other mixed couples start rug cutting in the second and third balconies. In this instance, the police officers chose to let the matter go. 2 months later, when Carl Perkins invited white teens who made up roughly 60% of his audience to join black dancers on the floor, police also declined to intervene. When white teenagers attempted the same feat at a Record Stars show featuring Fats Domino 1 week later, the results were different. When police stopped the music to tell black dancers to go back to their seats, Domino refused to play. Hundreds of concert goers ran to the box office to demand refunds, and the police panicked, ending the show and escorting the promoters out of the facility. Promoter R.J. Rossaw was offended, telling a journalist at the Pittsburgh Courier that he did not give Negro or white dances and all were invited to come. Since all the talk about desegregation, white teenagers are no longer content to come to dances featuring Negro artists and sit and listen while Negroes dance. The Courier concurred, noting white teenagers are getting their first taste of discrimination and they don't like it. The week after this incident, Houston Police Chief Carl Sheptine told promoters they would be denied the use of concert venues if they did not ensure that the races were kept separate during the show. In response, the Pittsburgh Courier noted there has not been a single interracial incident at the Houston dances in question. All the incidents have been touched off by police insisting on strict segregation and white teenagers determined to dance. Teenage dancers tearing down divisions at supposedly segregated concert venues was not entirely uncommon. As one of Little Richard's band members, H.B. Barnum, recalled, when I first went on the road, there were many segregated audiences. With Richard, although they still had the audiences segregated in the building, they were there together. And most times before the end of the night, they would all be mixed together. These actions had the potential to be viewed as political statements against segregation at a time when young civil rights activists were forcibly desegregating lunch counters and department stores. From the distance of the stage, many performers and producers believed that they saw this connection firsthand. You know, it was a revolution, Ralph Bass asserted. We did it as much with our music as the civil rights acts and all of the marches for breaking the race thing down. Chuck Berry recalls how several such incidents affected him while on tour. In one city, the white people there mixed with the blacks who were black as well as those who appeared white, leaving no black blacks or white whites feeling uncomfortable. In other, at the close, twice as many young whites as blacks rushed toward the stage, climbed on, and began socializing with us. We knew the authorities were blazing angry with them for rushing on stage and at us for welcoming them, but they could only stand there and watch young public opinion exercise its reaction to the boundaries they were up against. Even at the Apollo Theater, the cultural heart of Harlem's Black community, white folks mingled and conversed as Black as colored folks, if you know what I mean. Blacks and whites jived between each other. All were artists, playing foolish, having fights, and making love as if the rest of the world had no racial problems whatsoever. We felt like our music could bring these people together, Gladys and Merrill Knight asserted. We can bring everybody together. Race doesn't matter. When an interviewer asked Apollo Theater promoter Hal Jackson if he had been able to build bridges between Black people and white people during this period, he responded with an unequivocal, "Oh, yes." Black groups like the Temptations were such a popular draw, he says, that young people were coming out more and more after hearing it on the radio. They were coming out to see these groups. Once they were there, the interviewer continued, "You didn't play the race card. You integrated your show. You had Black musicians and white musicians on the radio. You were interested in brotherhood." And again, Jackson assented, "Yes, that's the whole thing." And yet, as Grace Elizabeth Hale has cautioned, attending mixed race concerts did not require white attendees to confront their racist or worried parents and friends or to face being beaten, gassed, kicked, arrested, and even killed. Singing together enabled people to feel the music. Deep in the heart, singing was not an argument or an ideology, it was a feeling. It was the tap of the foot and the leap of faith. While some people were inspired to go south and work, all a person had to do to feel like part of the movement was sing along. White teenagers like Bob R., who grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, could make light of efforts to segregate concert venues, recalling that somehow they divided the auditorium in half with Black people on one side and white people on the other. I think they ran a rope down the middle of the auditorium as the divider. How silly was that? But this derision did not generally translate into meaningful interactions that might actually help bridge racial chasms and create determination to challenge racist structures, despite what musicians and producers said about the power of music to bring people together. Although Bob C. says that he and his friends thought that integration was fine at the concerts they attended in Virginia Beach, and he even notes that some audience members mingled, it did not raise any concerns, and he does not recall ever having done so himself. Jeff T says that although most concerts he went to in Atlanta were not legally segregated, the races didn't mix much. Stan W cannot recall any problems among concertgoers of different races, but he adds that most of the shows he went to in Alabama were either majority white or majority Black, which minimized the chance for any real cross-racial interaction. And Rick T, who often attended majority Black concerts in Virginia, explains that most people did not attempt to communicate across racial boundaries. In retrospect, Black concertgoers were just as, I don't want to say the word afraid, but they were just as cautious as I was, because it was a new thing for both of us. And Bruce C., who remembers seeing shows at the Apollo in New York in the early 1960s, where he was among maybe 3 or 4 of us that constituted the white faces, enjoyed his experiences in majority Black audiences, but he does not remember any mingling whatsoever. They stayed where they were supposed to, Edgar S. says of segregated shows in his home state of Mississippi. That's the way it was. I expected that. That was the norm, unfortunately. Black respondents tend to recall whether concerts they attended were mixed race or segregated, but as with their responses to direct action campaigns, they did not seem terribly relevant to their own lives. Edgar S. remembers going to theaters and concert venues that were divided, but he asserts, I really didn't pay too much attention. I was focusing on the performer. Respondents who grew up in Detroit remember attending Motown reviews in the early 1960s, which featured a bevy of groups and performers signed to the local label. Even though most of the musicians were Black, the audiences were often interracial and rarely segregated by design. As Cheryl J. attests, everybody was into Motown. But even in these venues, mingling across racial lines remained rare. Rhonda E. states, I'm sure there had to be some white people there, but they didn't stick out. I didn't see them and think, oh, look. But her focus was similarly on the performers and not on the racial mix of the audience. When asked about whether these shows were segregated, she instead explains the ease with which she was able to access these venues. I never remember or even heard of a segregated anything in Detroit, she says. I never went into a theater and have not been able to sit where I wanted. Similarly, Misha B. was more inspired by the fact that local Black kids had become national celebrities than she was by any interracial appeal when she went to these concerts. It was the most wonderful thing to see them and to know that they were from Detroit, or if they weren't from Detroit, that they were based in Detroit for the music, she says. As with their views on direct action campaigns, many Black respondents were more interested in strong portrayals of young African American role models and with how their actions might make it easier for them to move freely through consumer spaces rather than the potentials of sharing a room with white contemporaries. White respondents, however, are more likely to recall their attendance in mixed-race concert venues as a sign that the country's values were changing and that civil rights struggles had triumphed, while simultaneously implying that integration in these arenas was not worth the massive opposition they saw on television. Those were integrated shows, Bob S. says of concerts he attended in New York, not forcefully, just how everybody went and had a good time. Michael P. similarly attended shows in New York where the top stars of the era would perform, and that was pretty much an integrated act also. The audiences too were mixed, he says, especially a Sam and Dave performance, which was a Hispanic, Black, and white crowd for sure. Jeff T. recalls how he and his friends were among the only white attendees at many shows in Atlanta, including a Ray Charles concert, but that we were always treated very courteously. While Ron R. is very dismissive of the KKK dumbasses with their hoods and their Confederate flags who protested a Beatles concert he attended in DC for refusing to play segregated venues. It was really irritating because here we were trying to be more diverse, more accepting, he says. These bastards were trying to preserve their sense of what the status quo should be. White respondents do not display the same heightened enthusiasm when recalling their own participation in desegregated spaces as they do when discussing their responses to sit-ins. Their almost nonchalant reflections, however, show that they supported desegregation in public spaces, they did not understand the opposition forged by white massive resistance or the violence and discrimination that Black kids often encountered when they entered these majority white or mixed race spaces. These responses also reflect beliefs that desegregation would be key to ending racial injustice overall by encouraging interracial interactions and mutual identification rather than the crucial first step towards granting full citizenship and mobility rights to African Americans as civil rights activists had originally intended. Black and white kids who grew up during this period may have supported the efforts of sit-in activists, but their distinct responses would shape the contours of post-civil rights racial liberalism in the decades to come. Black kids supported the sit-ins as a means of access to consumer spaces and more dignified treatment, but they were not necessarily convinced of the virtues of integration alone. White kids, however, expressed more shock at what they saw on their television screens and tended to use capitalist, democratic, or moral language to explain why they supported desegregation as a means of ensuring equal racial treatment. Their responses reflect reactions to entering desegregated or otherwise mixed-race musical venues, as Black respondents focus on representation and acceptability, while white respondents were more intent on showing that they were completely fine with entering these areas, even when they were in the minority and could therefore not understand the level of racist opposition. white kids more and more came to believe that integration could be a guaranteed aspect of citizenship. Since they rarely had to interact with actual Black people or the systemic discrimination they continued to experience, however, even when they shared the same spaces, many of the continued challenges of the following decades would be obscured and negated by beliefs that overt racism had already ceased to exist. All right, thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over, but all set.
So now we've entered the Q&A part. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute your mic, or if you feel more comfortable posting your question in the chat. Yep.
I see Bob Holly. Bob Holly has his hands up. Go ahead, Bob. Unmute yourself.
Okay, I don't know how important this is, but my life experience was different. I
Ooh.
graduated from high school in 1962 in Toledo, Ohio. And through my whole time living within the Catholic community, we were told that segregation was bad and all the races were equal. So in some sense, I had troubles dealing with this. Now, I admit that on the other side, there weren't a whole lot of Black Catholics, but it was actually one thing I was very proud of that the Catholic Church did, even though I subsequently left it.
Oh, sorry, it paused for a minute, but no, that is really interesting. And that's, I mean, I talked to a lot of people, and I think it sort of came through that even though there were patterns, people had very different experiences depending on where they lived and the kinds of families they came from and where their families moved. So I would love to talk to you more about your experiences as well, if you'd be open to that.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Walter can tell you how to get in touch with me. I still use my Wayne State email account.
That's awesome. Thank you. John?
First of all, Beth, thanks for a really wonderful talk. It's making me look forward to the book. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
My question was kind of along the lines of Bob's, but from a different direction, because I think about white relatives of mine who, you know, recall life in the 60s and talk about, oh, those backwards people in the South who were using fire hoses on peaceful protesters, and who can you believe that they were did all of that? And yet, you know, I remember things 30 years ago well enough to know that my white relatives, some of them were singing a rather different tune. You know, obviously I don't remember from the 60s, but you know, I certainly remember as a child that their recollection of recent history was quite different. And I wonder, you know, for you as an historian, what you do to sort of, if possible, correct for some of the, for lack of a better term, whitewashing of people's recollections in light of the fact that, you know, they know that a certain tide has turned on what's acceptable to say and what's not acceptable to say. So I was just wondering if, you know, if you as an historian could comment on that.
That is a really difficult thing to do with oral histories, because people are already censoring themselves, or I mean, sometimes they're not even aware they're doing what you're describing. And I hear that in pretty much every white person I talk to. To some extent, you can acknowledge that, and this is something that I do in the introduction of my manuscript, that you sort of say, like, you know, we read against the grain as much as we possibly can, but sometimes it's impossible to distinguish between, oh yeah, I definitely thought this, and you know, maybe you thought that in retrospect. If this makes sense, though, people almost always slip up. Like, I know that's a weird thing to say, but like, people will be saying all the right things that like we're expected to hear, but then they'll sort of, I mean, even my assistant who was transcribing these interviews for me, we were emailing, she was like, all these people are saying they're not racist, and then they just say something racist. Like, people tend to slip up when, like, no matter how much they think that they're that they've corrected for these things, it's oftentimes almost in spite of themselves. So like that's something that comes out. I hope that it's going to come out a lot better in the draft. I try to do a little bit of that with the stories in this talk. You know, people sort of saying like, I didn't see race, I don't care. And then, you know, clearly that's not a thing. But that is something that it's difficult, but I think it's not impossible given the ways that people sort of like betray themselves a little bit. If
Thank
that helps. I know that's not a
Yeah,
great
that
answer,
does help.
but.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hey,
This is Ali.
yes. So, Beth, you mentioned that there were two different kind of things going on, that the charts had already been integrated, right? So the pop music charts had
Yeah.
already been
Mhm.
integrated, but a lot of the
Yeah.
venues and performances and spaces were still pretty segregated.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about, did people take comfort in the fact that the charts were integrated? Was that used as a kind of foil to not
Yeah.
talk about all the segregation that still
Yes.
existed in the music world? I'm just wondering about that tension.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that I don't know that it was used as a foil. I think that the way that people talked about the integration of the charts was more just like, look, this is the way the world is going. This is ultimately going to challenge all the actual segregation that we're seeing on the ground. While at the same time, I don't get into this in this paper so much, a little bit, but a lot of Black artists are dealing with exploitation when they're dealing with their agents or their record labels. They're definitely dealing with segregation when they're touring, which is something that we've, I think, seen quite a bit of recently in pop culture. I don't think that it was necessarily used as a foil. It's never sort of presented as like, look, everything is okay because the charts are integrated and people are buying the same records. It was more presented as like, this is the first step on a path towards better things. Yeah, like the way that, particularly in Billboard, the way that they talk about this sort of integration is like, look, this is like a forecast. People are going to start listening to the same kinds of music. We're going to start going to these more integrated concerts. They're never really talking about it directly challenging anything politically, but the implication is that like we're on this better path. And this is something that I think a lot of white respondents are sort of like are sort of picking up on, even when they talk about their recollections today. They'll sort of say like, well, you know, I already I didn't think segregation was a good thing. And then I heard this music and how could I believe in segregation when I loved Chuck Berry and Little Richard so much? And I just thought it was really dumb. But then like, you know, you're still going to a majority white school, hanging out in majority white spaces, not really challenging these things very much. So I almost see it as like it was presented as this like first step towards things changing, but when they didn't totally change, a lot of white people just thought that that was enough, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered your question totally, but
Yeah, no, you did.
it wasn't
You
really
did. Thank you.
politicized, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a question in the chat from Dr. Raz. He says, it's more or less a comment that you might comment on it. The policies of systemic racism are not recognized by all, nor do people recognize their roles in these policies.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's a really great statement. Thank you so much.
I can expound just a little bit. I mean, you started to talk about what, you know, people making mistakes, and sorry that I'm in two meetings at one time, you know, and this trying to stay connected as much as possible. I'm in a faculty meeting on this side and this meeting 1 year and hearing things, but wanted to comment. I think that the presentation was great. It was very thorough. It was, you know, it was rich with information that people can kind of start to chew on and to provoke the conversation of this continuous like journey that we're all faced with within our roles, like I said, within the notion of systemic racism and how it exists in this country alone. I think, you know, as we watch time, there's often this notion of like, well, that can't be me. But the reality is that it's all of us, because if you're raised in this system, then you're playing a part, and me included, as a person of color, as a Black man, in this country, I'm raised in suburban white America. I grew up with the same sorts of like disdain for urban Black America that most people would grow up with in suburban environments. I had to work on my own to recognize my role in this kind of field. And the notion of combating or deconstructing systemic racism is an ongoing thing. It doesn't stop. To say that you're not a racist, I mean, if you're American, you're pretty much a racist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that goes for, I hate to be so frank, but for white people, because for people of color, we don't sit in a position of power. We can't be racist. We can only be biased and bigots. You know what I mean? Because the system of racism was not designed to give us leverage. So it's great that we're acknowledging who we are and what we feel, but we always have to recognize that in order to deconstruct the colonial system that exists in the world, we first have to start with the deconstruction of ourselves and figure out what active role we're playing to combat the racist policies that exist not only in this country but everywhere in the world, that oftentimes degrades specifically Black people, but also people of color. I mean, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and I feel like oftentimes it's very heightened with how young America is and how things have transpired in such a short period of time here. And I always think of America as this microcosm of the rest of the world. Everything that's existing here exists everywhere else in the world, just in a different scale. Here, it's just so in your face. You know what I mean? Like, and the strange thing about having lived in other countries and other continents is you recognize the image that America propagates to the rest of the world when you know the realities about what's actually happening in America. For instance, my wife is from Ethiopia. Me trying to convince her that America was not this place with streets paved with gold when we're in Ethiopia before we came to the States, and her not really understanding the notion of systemic racism, not even thinking of herself as Black. Why? Because she comes from Ethiopia. She doesn't have to think about that. You don't have to think about the color concept. You're thinking more about cultural differences. What do you mean, America?
Right.
Obama's in office. No, you don't get it. Like these are things that are shows of progress against the idea of racism, but the systems that be and the way that the government and the organization is designed, the policies increase as the racial progress increases.
Right.
So just wanted to make that comment, and thank you so much for your research and your work, Beth. This is phenomenal. We need more people that are willing to investigate these types of things objectively to keep this conversation going.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate it. And I wrote down a few things you said while you were talking, but I love how you said we have to figure out the active role that we're playing, because that is something that I think is missing in the ways that people describe their actions during this period, which is, maybe that's expecting too much, but like that is something that can really affect your perspective on what kinds of policies are necessary in order to address a problem, or even if this is still a big problem at all. Most people, when I ask them, do you think racism is still a big problem in our society? Nobody said no. Everybody said yes, but the ways that they understood that problem varied pretty widely. So I love how you phrase that. I'm going to keep that in mind as I go into my last chapter. So thank you so much.
Any other question for Beth? There is Kevin. Go ahead.
Thank you, Beth. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Kevin.
And I love the context of music that you framed things into. I find that really interesting. So I grew up in Dearborn in the mid 60s. And so I think it's clear about what the racial attitudes were at that time in that place. But ironically, music, there's a documentary that just came out about Robin Seymour, who was a disc jockey in Detroit of
Wow.
pretty big renown in his day. And he worked at a station in Dearborn, WHMK, which later became Keener 13, more famously. And it was a top 40 station in Dearborn. And guess what? He played Motown. He played R&B and soul. If
Right.
it was charting, he was playing it. But he also played the Rolling Stones, and he also played, Jan and Dean and all the Leslie Gore and all the white bubblegum pop music too. He was simply playing music that was charting that kids wanted to hear. And music for those of us growing up in Dearborn, which was primarily white, especially on the west side of Dearborn at that time, um, music was a bridge, and we couldn't see live music that wasn't white in Dearborn anywhere growing up.
Wow.
But we could go to Detroit, we could go to Inkster, we could go to other places and hear the music live that we were hearing on the radio, and would do that. So that was music was such a huge bridge for us growing up in a very segregated, very racist suburb. This was during the Orville Hubbard years. And
Right.
but ironically, yeah, one of the stations that really started integrating their playlists was actually located in Dearborn. The studio was on Michigan Avenue near Greenfield. And they did it strictly. I don't think there was any great social motives. They did it because they wanted the ratings.
Yeah,
They were
exactly.
motivated financially. I mean, that was strictly it. It was business. But as kids listening to radio then, which was our main conduit for music, we didn't understand that. We just knew we were really digging what we were hearing, and we
Nice.
out of our this exclusive white area we were living in to other parts of Metro Detroit and into Detroit. And it was the music that hooked up, that brought us in and got us to know other people and other cultures from
Love that.
whom we grew up with. Anyways, I just wanted to. So when you talk about music, it really is impactful in a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. So thank you.
Love that. Thanks, Kevin.
Mark has a comment.
Thank you, Walter. Beth, that was terrific. And
Thanks.
I'm one of those white kids who was taught how to twist in 1961.
Love it.
You can imagine me in sixth grade, and they would, during indoor recess, they would line up the boys along one line of the basketball court and the girls about 5 feet away. And this was it, as stiffly as possibly imagined. What's interesting to me, though, I think your presentation was just terrific.
Thank you.
It compelled me to reflect on my experiences then, and I have to say that as an 11-year-old in 1961, I wasn't aware of the twist or chubby checker as Black music. That is, there was never,
Right.
I don't recall any discussion of where it came from. This is about a year or so before I started listening to the rock and roll AM radio stations. So I felt like it wasn't that I transcended anything. I was oblivious to it. And it really was a couple years later with the growing engagement of civil rights protests in the South that you became aware of it. And I think very much, I mean, I grew up in an all-white suburb. The only Black kids in our school were the special needs
Oh,
students.
wow.
And the consequence was that by 62, 63, I found myself much more aware, and my own experience, and here I'll try to be brief. If you want to talk more about it another time, I'd be happy to. But it was really then, I remember we had some workmen at our house. And I don't know how the conversation, maybe I made up the conversation, but at some point I had said something about pro-civil rights, and the workman said, what would you do if colored people moved into the house next door? And my response as a 12 or 13-year-old was, I guess we'd move. And so I wasn't,
Wow.
so I owning up to my
Yeah.
racism. Um, but I
Yeah.
remember vividly after they left, my father chewed me out. He
Wow.
was so angry with me. Dad had been a pre-World War II socialist, very much a middle of the road Democrat after, but it was like my first lesson in
Wow.
anti-racism from my father, who was absolutely livid. He said if a Negro family could move next door, of course they would be welcome here. Um,
Right.
I mean, for him, the issue was more one of suburban class than it was about race. And I think that for me, it was a mix of the personal, the ways in
Yeah.
which my father, put down his foot, made obviously an indelible impression all these years later, but also then engaging with other people who were more engaged. And I found myself, I recently found a ninth grade project that I had done with a colleague on the civil rights movement, with
Wow.
lots of photographs cut out from Newsweek, talked about Black Muslims. And this was the fall of 63.
Right.
And I'll stop right now, but it may be a great symbolism here. I'm not sure what the symbolism is, but I spent the Christmas winter break in 1963 typing up this report, and all the while listening to this new group that I was just beginning to hear about, the Beatles.
Right. Yeah.
And so every time a Beatles song came up on, I think it was 5:60 a.m., I'd get up and dance, and then I'd sit back down and type on issues of race. So I don't know what to make of
Wow.
my experience, but I think it gets at layers of complexity and
Yeah.
different relationships that turned me into what I am. And at the same time, I can own up to other racist experiences of youth that I'd rather not discuss. But it it was complicated in that sense
Yeah.
for me. And curiously, yeah, I'm trying. I have to think more about the engagement with Black music, though. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. And I like how you're explaining those different levels. Like that's something that I get at in sort of an earlier chapter. But a lot of people have stories similar to yours that like, you know, this was something that their parents were invested in, but they didn't really pay attention until they started seeing um, campaigns on TV or until they started listening to music, or maybe their parents really were racist and they had to sort of unlearn a lot of that kind of thing through these other methods. But yeah, it's funny, when I started this project a million years ago, I thought it was going to be a lot more cut and dry and a lot less complex than it wound up being. There are a lot of stories like yours where these different components sort of pulled people in different directions and encouraged them to think about things differently. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. And oh,
Thank you.
Mary, you wanted a quick question?
I had two quick things I was going to say. If you were going to use the twist as a marker for integration, there's a wonderful documentary on Canopy in our own library that
nice.
it's about an hour and a half long, but it was made in the 1990s.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of halfway between then and now. And it interviews a lot of people that were in dance, you know, groups and American Bandstand, whatever it was. It also shows the kind of the history of the twist being an integrative, you know, people, integrated audiences, both racially and then eventually generationally. You know, it's quite an interesting thing.
Nice.
The second thing I was going to say, when you were describing someone who grown up in Detroit and wasn't aware of any segregation, like in the concert hall downtown, you know, the Greystone Ballroom until I don't know when had, you know, nights that were reserved for African Americans and all this, and so kind of matching up those interviews with facts on the ground,
right?
The history, some of those venues. If you're going to use venues as a way of fleshing out your ideas, is might be something to think about.
Yeah.
And also, there's such a huge difference geographically, and what people, you know, how people lived, how they responded, whether they were where, you know, I'm sort of like Mark Crewman. I knew all this music. I didn't think about who made it. They were all grown-ups who made it. They were white and black. They were just adults, you know. So there is that. But I think geographically is hugely. It's hard to compare something about the Apollo Theater and something in Virginia. You know. So
yeah, I mean that's something that is expanded on in the chapter, but you're right. Even when I have more room, it is a very difficult thing to tackle all these differences. So, thank you for. Yeah, that's definitely something I have to work on. Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you all again. I mean, it was such an interesting talk that it has gone on for almost 2 hours, and that's very good. I mean, it just shows people are interested in it. And apparently, Beth has given us permission to post the lecture on our website. So Kennedy will do that within a week. So I now turn the floor over to Kennedy, who has a little spiel before we go.
Yes, as Dr. Edwards mentioned, this has been recorded and it should be on the website. Our webmaster usually gets it up next day, but towards the end of the week, just to be on the safe side, Friday for sure. It's going to be posted on our website and our YouTube page. But thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you. And I think this presentation was so well crafted and really initiated some constructive conversations. And we're so very glad on behalf of the Humanities Center to give you the platform and to get a little insight into your research. And we're excited for the book. We're definitely going to be reaching out to you for next school year to have you do another talk, because these talks are so important and should always be followed up. And as a small token of the Humanity Center's gratitude, we do have some gifts for you. We give them to all of our speakers. It's just a mask and a journal with our Humanity Center logo on it. We're reaching out to our speakers individually towards the end of the semester, going on to the next, to safely get these to you because of COVID. But thank you so much. It's definitely been a great talk. Thank you to our audience that have stayed on this long too. Again, it's being recorded, so if you want to go back, take some notes, or look at the presentation some more, it will be on our website. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I very much appreciated everyone coming and listening and everyone's questions and comments. And thank you, Kennedy. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for hosting me. This has been really great. Thanks.
You're welcome. Everyone be safe and happy holidays.